So now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our presenters for today. We are joined by Beth Buffington. Beth is a recent past president of the Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia, and she's also one of the leads of our Saturday morning plant clinic at the Arlington Courthouse Farmers Market. She's spent over 30 years working as a professional architect, and she worked with talented landscape professionals and picked up gardening as a hobby during that time. We also have with us today presenting Kurmit Rockwell. Kurmit is an engineer and a fig hobbyist. He's grown over 100 varieties of figs and currently maintains about 70 varieties at his home and community garden. He runs a Facebook and an Instagram account called Figs for All. And outside of fig tending, he enjoys gardening, hiking, and spending time with his wife and 3 kids. And then finally, we'd also like to acknowledge Bonnie Packer, who's with us today, and she supported the development of today's presentation. So welcome, Beth and Kurmit, and I will turn it over to you now to get us started with our presentation.
Thank you, Caitlin. Kurmit and I are both looking forward to doing this presentation. And I titled this first section, The Romance of Figs, because I personally think figs are really romantic and exotic. My family's from the Midwest. We had apples and cherries and pears, but not figs. So we're going to talk a little bit about our relationship with figs. In my heart, I believe figs are exotic because they're from the Middle East and the Mediterranean. Humans have carried figs all over the world as we have moved into different areas. In their natural state, they're a large rambling tree, and they often grow in protected areas. You would see them frequently in the Middle East, just growing naturally along stream beds and along roads. Early human history is very entwined with the fig. Figs have been cultivated since the Neolithic period, and archaeologists have done excavations where they have found historic fig plantings that were clearly maintained as a separate crop area. Cultivation of figs predates the domestication of cereal crops, which is one of the things that's defined as an early civilization. It would be domestication of cereal crops. I love this image, which is from an Egyptian tomb, and you can see up there the baboons are eating figs out of the tree, and they're collecting the figs because it's a very important food source. This is an image of Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Eden, and when I showed this image to Kermit, he said to me, "Well, that's not a fig leaf." And I said, "Well, yeah, but this was done by a Dutch artist, 1533, and probably never seen a fig tree." We all take it for granted that although figs are very prolific in a lot of different environments, probably in Northern Europe, no one had ever seen a fig tree. Figs are mentioned frequently in the Bible, and they are always mentioned as symbols of fertility and prosperity and abundance. And so they are always presented that way in art. And this is art from very different periods, a sort of contemporary image of a bowl of figs on the top right-hand corner, carvings of figs in a Roman temple of some kind, and then this other painting, which is from the 17th century. Always these images evoke prosperity and wealth and richness. And that's why I think of figs, very exotic, very rich. And so I planted a fig tree. My fig tree has developed beyond all expectations. So now I have a different kind of problem. I have a very large fig tree, and now I have to figure out every year what to do with my figs. So we're going to talk about that a little later after we talk a lot about figs, how to cultivate them, and what to expect. Kermit?
Thanks, Beth. All right, so we're going to cover these topics here on the screen. So first, what are figs? Figs are really interesting. They're actually inverted flowers. And you can see a couple of those in the pictures split open. There's many little tiny flowers that make up a fig, and they're all inside of the fig sac, or the synconium is what it's called. They are related to the mulberry family, and the species is called ficus, and there's over 800 varieties of ficus, and they're very important in the world for maintaining habitat for animals, food source. And there's just a couple of ficus species there, fiddly fig, strangler fig, but the one that we all eat is called Ficus carica. And there's over 1,000 varieties and growing every year of Ficus carica. And those are the ones you'll see in the store, and you grow and you see your neighbors growing. Even though it's a flower, I just want to make the point that we will be calling it a fruit. It's kind of like a standard way to talk about it. So just to let you know. Okay, well, how many types of figs are there? There's 4 main types of Ficus carica, and you're only familiar locally with the one on the bottom. It's called the common fig. It's self-fertile, and it doesn't need a fig wasp. We're going to be talking about fig wasps shortly. We get a lot of questions about that. But being self-fertile doesn't mean you can take the seeds from the fig and grow it. It just means it'll ripen on the tree, and it doesn't need pollination from a fig wasp. At the top, we've got the Smyrna fig, and that needs a fig wasp. And they're grown in the Mediterranean and throughout the world. Also in California, there's a fig that needs the fig wasp that's grown commercially. San Pedro fig only needs to be fertilized for the main crop, and we'll talk about main crop and Breba crop late in a little bit. And then the Capra figs, those are the male figs with the pollen that the fig wasps use to pollinate the figs. So just want to make it clear, we're going to talk about the common figs, which don't need fig wasp, but let's talk a little bit about the fig wasp to give you some background on that. So the 2 questions I get the most are, do we eat wasps in our figs? And do we have this fig wasp in the Virginia, Maryland, Delaware area? So first, there are no fig wasps here. They need like a Mediterranean type climate to live. There are some in California, different places. So we don't have it here, and that's why we don't have any wasps in our figs. But do you eat wasps? Well, not really, because the wasps are assimilated through enzymes in the fig in the areas that do have wasps. So they're not actually eating wasps in these other areas of the country that do have wasps. And these photographs here, these are from Google AI Gemini. They're not to scale, so I just want to get it out there. The wasps are not that big. They're very tiny, about the size of a pinhole on a needle. And this just shows the idea that the Capra fig is where the pollen is, the wasp emerges, then enters the female fig, and then the seeds are then fertile. You can grow them into actual trees. So that's your lesson on fig pollination, but we're not going to talk about wasps anymore because they don't come into play here in our area. All right, let's talk about the 2 types of crops we have. All right, there's a Breba crop, and then there's the main crop that we get in our area. And on the left is the Breba crop. They only form on last year's wood or 2-year-old wood. And I can immediately tell at that picture you see there that that's Breba because there's no leaf. I know it's last year's wood because it's a deciduous tree and the leaves fall off in the fall. So I know those are Breba. They're usually different shape than the main crop. These are very elongated, and they actually taste differently and might have different texture also. And on the right are the main crop figs. They only grow on this year's new greenwood. You can see the little arrow pointing to little figlets there. They have a leaf associated with it, and that's how you can easily tell. These are the ones usually people are waiting for because they taste better usually than the Breba crop. Here's some figs that are common in our area, and I'll highlight Celeste. That's probably what most people have in the area. It's a really great fig because it has a closed eye at the bottom, so it doesn't let in pests, and it's really resistant to a lot of rain. So you can get rain and they won't split open. Great fig. Chicago Hardy's also a really good fig for our area. And here's some pictures of what they look like. Brown turkey there on the top left. And then the popular Celeste fig. These figs have different flavor profiles as well. So the Celeste, I would call a sugar fig. It's very sweet, almost brown sugar. Whereas if you get to the Chicago Hardy on the right, it's kind of like a berry flavor. And then the Osborne and Brunswick on the bottom, those are like honey or agave flavored figs. Very light flavored and fresh and pair well with different cheeses. So there's probably about 20 different fig taste profiles. And that's one of the great reasons to grow your own figs. Number one, you can't get them in the store. They don't have a long shelf life, and so they won't do well in transportation. And there's so many different flavor profiles. And here's some pictures of local heirloom figs, I'll call it. And I just give my definition on the top left. These are figs that have been passed down. They have a long history here. And I'll just give you a little story about the Higbee fig on the top and on the right. That fig was grown by the Higbee family on Hog Island over 100 years ago. And then that island, as you know, the locals know, that island was submerged underwater over the last 40, 60 years, or partially submerged. And so the family moved off the island and brought this fig tree and has grown it ever since. And so it's been in local distribution on the eastern shore of Virginia. These are what we're going to cover for cultivation. I'll talk about this slide a little bit. Your first decision is, are you going to do potted or in-ground figs? The main reason to go potted is you're in a very cold area or you're limited with space. I do both. I have potted figs and in-ground. And I started out in-ground, but soil conditions in my area are not really great for figs. They're compacted clay, and so it makes it hard to grow figs. So I started a container in my front yard, but I have a garden plot at Chinkpin Garden in Alexandria, and I grow quite a few figs there, and they do really well. So another thing to consider is if you're in a cold area, we get down to zone 5B. I'll show you a picture of the zones and how cold that is, but you want to start off in potted figs zone 6A, 5A, because it's so cold, you get a lot of dieback. These other items here, we're going to cover on the next couple of slides in a little more detail. So our climate is really good for figs in most areas. I'm in zone 8A on the fringe of 7B in Alexandria, but we go up to zone 8B, and there's not a lot of areas where it's too cold in the 5B, 6As, but there definitely are. And the main problem with being in the colder areas is the low temperatures in the winter. When you get down to like 0 degrees, 10 degrees, even 15 degrees for long periods of time, you can get dieback or damage to your figs. And so microclimate becomes very important. If you're near mass walls or near a house or something, it can make a big difference. From my own experience, I had a lot of dieback this last winter at Chinkpin Garden because I'm in a low-lying area, kind of exposed. And so I had some dieback on those trees. We were down about 15 degrees. But at my house, I have an in-ground tree that didn't have any damage. And so it's in a nice little microclimate next to a warm foundation. All right, so sun and soil. A lot of people think you need bright, direct sun for your figs or you can't plant them, but I found that partial shade is fine, and so is Beth as well. And I'll show you a picture of some trees like that. They'll do just fine. Soil is probably in-ground. Most location is going to be good, except for the compacted clay I mentioned earlier. And your pH is going to range anywhere from 5.5 to 8. Typically, they'll do okay, but typically they're around 6 to 7 pH. If your tree is in the shade, it may affect the time it takes to ripen and potentially the sweetness, although I haven't seen large differences. Now here's a picture on the left that shows 2 figs that were picked at the same time from the same tree, but one was in total shade within the center of the tree, getting no sun, and the outside of the tree, it's darker. And when I tasted these figs, they didn't really have any difference in flavor. It's just the way it looked on the outside. And on the right is a picture of a Celeste tree that's very much shaded throughout the year, and it produces very good tasting fruit. That's one of my neighbor's trees. Nutrition, all right? So if you have your tree in ground, it's likely you may not need to do anything, no added nutrition, but it'll depend on your soil. And if you're not producing figs, you might want to get your soil tested. A good practice is to top layer with compost and work it in every year. For container figs, though, it's a totally different story. A lot of the potting soils don't have many nutrients, so you really have to watch what you're putting in. And there's 17 essential nutrients. You should just check what you're using to make sure that you have everything your plant needs. There's generally 3 categories. There's the water soluble that you would need to use every 1 to 2 weeks, slow release granules 4 to 6 weeks, and then controlled fertilizers, which last much longer. Personally, I've been using the slow release granules combined with water soluble. That would be like a Miracle Grow. So if your tree is in ground and it's been established, you probably won't need to water it much at all, if ever, except during very dry conditions. But if you're just putting the tree in the ground, it's a small tree, then you'd want to do deep watering weekly until it gets established. And then usually if I put a tree in May and water it the next May, a year later, I usually don't have to water it hardly at all. For potted plants, totally different again, because now you're in these containers that dry out a lot quicker and they're smaller, more confined. So I use drip irrigation as my preferred method, and it saves me a ton of time. I used to have to water by hand. It's a very efficient way to do it. And I shoot for about 20% of the container volume during the hottest days. A good practice is to break up the watering, maybe once around 4 or 5 a.m. and then another before it gets too hot in the day.
Yeah, this is actually a picture of my tree at the base, and you can see first of all that it's up against a fence. It's between a fence and the side of my house, very much like that other image that Kermit just showed. And what has somewhat limited light, has light from both sides. It's on the north side of the house. But the point of this slide is you can see the number of surface roots that are going out in all directions from the tree. And I don't really water it. I did just last week because we had had no water for a month, but I typically don't water it, but it is a water hog. It is taking all of the water resources in this side of the yard, and nothing grows underneath it. Tiny little weeds, but nothing really significant at all. It's also in a very sheltered location there.
All right, thanks, Beth. How much space you need for your figs? Well, it depends on how much space you have and how many figs you want. And I'll tell you how varied it can be. But if you're in ground, you can be as close as 4 feet. I've tried even closer with no problems, anywhere from 4 to 20 feet. For containers, you can actually have the containers planted next to each other. But something to consider is the size of the container limits the size of your fig. So if you have a small container, a gallon, it'll only get so big and mature. But if you put a 5-gallon, it'll be much bigger. So it's kind of like a goldfish in that respect, and matches the size of what you're growing it in. And this shows you a picture of my front yard. I've got about 50 pots here, and they're growing side by side. I've got it in kind of a kidney-shaped circle, and I prune them so that they can be close together, but not too much overlap of leaves, and they do just fine. And we're going to get into some pruning, and these are what we're going to cover. First, why we prune. There's 2 main reasons. One is to shape your tree to increase your fig production, because the more you prune it, you're going to grow lateral branches, and that will grow the figs, and so you'll increase the opportunity for figs to grow. And the other reason is to manage the height so you can harvest the figs. You've probably seen neighbor trees that are 20, 25 feet tall, and only the birds and squirrels can get them. All right, so those are the 2 main reasons. The other bonus is you get cuttings when you prune them, and you can grow new fig trees, which we'll be covering shortly. So what happens if we don't prune? So this tree on the right is about 8 feet tall, no branches to speak of, and so we're only going to get figs on that tall, skinny branch. It's in a pot, so it's going to fall over really easily. So why did I do that? Well, because I wanted to try the Brava, and so I didn't want to prune it to remove last year's wood. So I was really excited. I heard this was a good variety, and it was really excellent. All right, so when to prune. So I'm going to talk about tree pruning and bush pruning, and these are kind of my subjective definitions, calling a tree form 1 to 2 main stems, and a bush form is anywhere from 3 to 7 plus main stems for a bush tree. So you can prune when the tree's dormant, the leaves will fall off, and so I do it around November, and then you can also do it around March or February, late in the winter. And so that picture there shows you this summer, I had a squirrel prune this branch for me. It took off the branch with all the figs on it. and it started to grow more branches, just like as if I pruned it myself. All right, so first let's cover tree form. And this is kind of an art. So these are just general steps, but this will give you an idea. It takes 3 years. In the first year, I take the main stem that I want to be part of the tree and I cut it back 12 to 24 inches. That's my preference. And I usually leave 3 to 4 nodes so branches can grow out of them. I haven't talked about nodes yet, but I'll show you what a node is later. And then what grows, usually there's 3 or 4 branches that grow after I prune. Then the next year, I would call those the scaffold branches. And then I would prune those back approximately a third, sometimes more or less. And then more branches grow off of those. Then the third year, I prune those also back approximately a third, some more or less. And then after that, I maintain the height I want and the shape I want. And here's a couple examples up at the garden. This tree on the left, actually, it has a sucker that I decided to allow to grow, and that's on the right side. I thought it balanced the tree out a little more, so that was kind of my preference when I was shaping the tree to do that. The tree on the right is kind of a lessons learned, because after the first pruning of the main stem, I had a bunch of scaffolds come out, but I pruned them a little too high. I would prefer to prune them lower, maybe almost half as much, so I could get to the figs a little easier. So that's a little lessons learned. All right, for bush form, as you can imagine, you kind of get a head start because you've got 3 to 7 plus branches. It's like the scaffolds of the tree form I was just talking about. And you kind of only need like 2 years to get that started because you've already got your scaffolds growing. And you'd same idea, kind of prune it back a third at a time, second year as well. And then third year and beyond, prune is needed for your height. And here's a lesson learned of a bush growing tree at the garden. I left way too many scaffolds, about 17 plus, and a huge dense canopy. All the energy is being put into growing the vegetation, the leaves, instead of ripening figs. So I had to cut this down quite a bit to get it to fruit. I've learned a lot over the years, so hopefully you can learn from my mistakes. I want to show you a video of a tree that I pruned just to give you a better idea. See if this works. Okay, great. So this is a chalice-shaped pruning tree. I like this shape. So the first year I pruned about 1.5 feet off the ground, that center piece. And then I got 4 branches come out, which you don't always get that. Sometimes you get less. Then the second year I came and pruned right there and I got 2 more branches. And then third year I pruned right there in the middle and got another 4 branches. And so I've been maintaining the height now. I'm going to highlight, you'll see a darker area there, about 4 inches, 5 inches. That's the new growth from last year. And there's some breba there you see growing. This year I didn't prune at all, and it grew another 4 or 5 inches, and I got brand new figs, plus I had the breba from last year on there. So that's an example. You may not get the same results, but it gives you a good idea. Let's show you one more that has leaves on it and is growing some figs to show you the effect of work. There we go. So here you'll see a tree that I cut a little higher, maybe more than 2 feet for the main stem. And I only got 3 branches come out. I didn't get 4 on this particular one. But then I pruned it a couple more times over the next few years. And you'll see the figs that form on this tree from each pruning creates more figs. And this tree, anyone want to guess how many figs are in it? You can put it in the chat, and I'll mention it as soon as the video is over. But you'll see another place where I pruned it right here. You'll see a pruning right there where it was cut and created more branching. All right. So how many figs do you think are on that? There's 47.
43, 60.
That's good. Yeah, right in the middle. I'm 47 on that tree. And I'm just down to the last 2 figs that are still ripening. All the others have ripened before that. All right, Beth, I'm going to turn it over to you for this.
This is a tree which people who are in our area in Arlington could actually go and visit. It is in an area called the Small Space Garden, which is one of MGNV's demonstration gardens behind the Fairlington Community Center. You can see it actually is in a really small area. It's back there. There's some HVAC equipment, and they've put up this fence and they're training this fig along this fence. And I was pointed out to me by one of the gardeners that we generally talk about fruit trees being espaliered when we train the branches out along a wall. But in fig trees, it's called fanning. And so these photographs were taken very early this spring. So the foliage is just starting. And Elaine Mills, who's one of our facilitators, was also the author of these photographs. But you can see it's in a very small, narrow area and growing along this fence. So this is later this summer. I went out there with the master gardener who tends that small space garden, Angela McNamara, and she took these photographs. But you can see the way in the bottom right-hand photograph, the fig is growing in a series of stems up the ground, and that is the fan effect of their pruning, and it is already starting to bear fruit. She said it grew a lot more than that they had anticipated because of all the water they had this year. And so it's gotten quite tall over the top of the fence. And there's some fruit they can't reach. And they're going to have a slightly different pruning strategy next year, but keep it along that fence.
Thank you, Beth. Now we're going to get into propagating, and these are the methods that we're going to cover. All right, first, a little more background. I've been talking about nodes and different things. Let's talk about fig cuttings, because most people use fig cuttings to propagate. So let's spend some time here. That arrow on the left pointing to the node, that's kind of the part of the branch where the leaf comes out in the fig. The green circle there is the leaf that I cut, and right above it, that other circle is a fig that was harvested earlier in the year. And the node is a little wider. There's kind of a wide rim around the branch, and that's where a lot of the plant hormones are, where you grow your roots and your leaves. The terminal or apical bud is on that picture on the right there, the green arrow. And that's important because you have to plant it when you're propagating so that it's pointing in the right direction. So the apical bud, the terminal bud really helps you know it's got to go with the bud on the top. And then you'll get used to that the larger leaf circle and the smaller fig is on the top. That will help you for some cuttings that are missing the terminal bud. So you want at least 3 of those nodes to start a fig tree. I prefer more, but 3 is like the minimum you want. And you usually put 1 to 2 nodes under the soil to grow roots. And I like to see around 8 inches for the cutting and a thickness of about a 1/2 inch or the thickness of a Sharpie marker. And those are ideal, but you can do thinner, thicker, longer, shorter. You can do all kinds of varieties of fig cuttings, but those are my preferences. So you can break the rules at any time, as I show there. Some optional things that people do to figs on the bottom right there, you can scrape the bottom of the fig node to help generate some roots. I've done some experimentation. It does create more roots there, but you don't have to do that. And I just scrape it down to the bright green, which is called cambium, which we'll cover that in a few slides. Your cutting might dry out. And if you do, then you would put vapor barrier around it. That's parafilm I put around that one, but it's optional. And then you can also soak your cuttings in water. On the right, it shows that, but you don't have to do that. But sometimes that can aid in the rooting also. So that's a little background. Now let's talk about 2 rooting methods. We'll talk about a pre-rooting method and a direct rooting method. And you'll see lots of different descriptions of these. So I make the definition sort of what I mean by this. The pre-rooting method is a 2-step process that I'm going to be talking about. You develop roots and possibly stems and leaves before you plant it in the final container you want. And the good thing about it is it saves space and you only plant what roots. There's potential for transplant shock though, because you're forming roots and retransplanting it, which might be a problem when you put it in the next container. Direct rooting is only 1-step process. Just put it directly in your soil or your media that you're going to grow in. It takes up a little more space, but it's a lot simpler. And that picture there is just rooting in water. That's a 2-step process, pre-rooting. And I did that just for fun because I like to try different methods. I like putting it on my windowsill and just enjoying it while I'm in the house. Pre-rooting, direct rooting share many of the same features. You can do it from cuttings any time of the year. I've done it summer, winter, fall. It doesn't matter. You can use many different grow media options. So I use mainly a peat mix, but you can use cocoa coir, soil from your yard, and water, as I just showed you. And it's optional, but you can use a rooting hormone also because it helps to make roots a little faster. The main thing you need are high humidity and a good warm temperature in the 70s to low 80s to root the figs. And so, depending on your situation, you might need to create more humidity by placing a bag around your cutting, like you see in this picture. Or if it's cold, if it's the winter in your basement, you might need to add a heating pad underneath to get it to root. So, you just have to take into consideration your specific situation. All right, here's a pictorial of one pre-rooting method. There are so many. You'll find many on the web, and you can make your own method, but this is just taking a cutting and scraping it down to the bright green cambium you see, a little rooting hormone on it, and then directly into a peat mix. And then I separated the peat mix with little plastic sheets to keep the commingling of the roots down to a minimum. And then you'll see the result on the bottom left after they grew. Leaves, and then in the bottom there, you just see me pulling out one of them, and I'm having to pull the roots apart and then cut some of the roots and then up pot it into the final container on the right. And then the water method, it's slower to use water, but I think it's fun to watch the roots grow in water. So I try it, usually take a couple of cuttings and try it in water. And usually you have to replace the water once a week roughly. And it's good to use water from the city because it's got a little chlorine in it and it helps keep down any mold growth. And then you just have to be careful when you up pot it because the roots, you don't want to damage them when you up pot them. So the direct rooting method, again, many ways to do it. You can go directly in the ground. I show you some examples here of going into these, they're called tree pots. They're 4-inch by 4-inch by 8 inches deep. And I've got two different methods there. In the middle picture, I show directly in the soil. And then the other one, I have a plastic bag on the left, you'll see that wraps around to keep the humidity high. And I did this summer just to see the difference between the two. And I'm having a lot more success with maintaining humidity by using the bag with that little hair clip there on the left to keep it moist. And then there's a picture there from Bonnie that she uses a styrofoam cup with a little bag on it to keep it humid. And then you've got a soda cup, 32-ounce soda cup on the bottom right. You just put a lid on it to maintain humidity. So there's so many creative ways you can root your figs. So air layering, what's that? So this is the quickest way to get a mature tree that you can get fruit from. And it is pretty quick. It takes about 3 to 4 weeks for it to work. And I'm going to show you a pictorial that kind of takes you through all these steps I have on the sub-bullets there. So this, you start with a plastic container on the top left. That's just a tub I got. I think it was Trader Joe Parmesan cheese tub. And I just cut it in such a way that it fits around the limb of a growing tree. This is a potted tree I was doing. And then I just scraped it down to the cambium layer and then put a rooting hormone on it, put some soil in it, wrapped it in plastic, and then aluminum foil to keep the sun from heating up too much. And then about a month later, you can see all the roots when I cut it off of the tree. And then that's basically ready to direct pot right into the pot you see on the right there. And I keep it in the shade for about 2 weeks, water it, and then the roots grow very quickly. That's a great way to get a tree in the summer for your friends and family. Grafting. This is probably the hardest method to do, but the nice thing about grafting is you can use a very small amount of plant material. You can use 1 inch or even less to grow a fig tree. And I'm going to go over the simplest method that I know of that's been very successful for me. It's called banana graft. And you'll see an example of the banana graft in that picture. The cambium layer I was talking about, that's the bright green on the rootstock. I'll call as the rootstock. It has the banana peel look to it, where that's the actual growing fig tree that I will then peel back and then put in the cutting. And I cut the cutting to expose that green layer, the cambium. And all that you need is those two layers to touch one another securely to graft, to create a good, strong union. There's so many methods and there's so many creative ways to do it, but this is a really nice method because it has so much surface area to connect the rootstock to the cutting that it makes it very successful. So let's show you a pictorial of how this works. So starting with the top left, you just cut in two places, about as deep as you want your cutting to go in. You peel the bark back, and then you cut out the center piece, and then you line up on the bottom, you'll see me lining up the cutting, and I cut it to expose the cambium, and then I roll some rubber bands up and then cover it with a little bit of parafilm to keep it moist. And I didn't show it, but I also put aluminum foil around it to keep any sun off of it. And then about 4 weeks later, you can see the result on the right, starting to grow some leaves. And I would encourage anyone to try this. It's really not that hard. All right, good place to stop for questions, Caitlin.
Oh, yes, we have a lot of questions. So why don't we start out with some pruning questions? So we had somebody mention that their trees bloom late and they don't ripen. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on that. They were in Charlottesville, Virginia.
I'm not familiar with the weather there. You might want to type it in while I'm talking if it's cold in the winter. But so if you're having trouble, so you pruned it and then you're forming fruit late, I wonder potentially if you're pruning too late in the year, maybe in the spring too late after leaves have formed, that might create figs that come out too late. Another thing is if you know the variety, it may be a late variety, and in which case some figs take 120 days to ripen, some take 60 days to ripen. So that's good to know what variety you're using too. So that's just two areas to look at. It might be other things as well, but I have to know more information.
There was also a question specifically about brown turkey, and if a lot of folks are growing brown turkey, just if there is any specific suggestions for that variety for pruning.
I think brown turkey would follow the pruning that we talked about. That would be a good one. In fact, the tree that I showed in the video, the first one with the chalice shape, that was brown turkey. So that works well for that one.
Okay. And then another question was whether specific varieties have pruning techniques that are best for them.
Yeah, good question. That is 100% true. So some trees only produce breba. There's one called Desert King, and it's grown a lot in the Pacific Northwest. And some people grow it in Virginia, but it's only ripens breba, not main crop. It needs a wasp. It's the San Pedro fig I mentioned that needs a wasp. Since we don't have it, the main crop falls off. So they have to prune those trees only for breba to make sure there's 2-year wood, so the breba form.
And is there anything with respect to the bush versus tree forming with pruning that is dictated by the specific variety? Or is that a personal choice?
It's both, actually. That's a great question. Some trees naturally grow as a tree, and some want to grow as a bush. Like Violet de Bordeaux seems to want to grow as a bush. And that tree I showed that had too many scaffolds, that was Violet de Bordeaux. And so it's really the tree that decides for itself in many cases. However, when I'm growing in pots, I pretty much force them all to be trees for space constraint reasons. And so I will make it be a tree in a pot, and I will let it be itself in the ground.
That actually will take us to some questions about space. So I know you've showed a lot of photos and videos of fig trees growing in different size pots and spaces, but there was somebody who was just curious, maybe you could definitively tell us, is there a minimum pot size? And somebody else was curious of like sort of how big is ideal for a container. So maybe you can give us some more of your final take on that.
I had the same question when I started and I thought bigger was better, but I quickly found out I couldn't move a 10-gallon fig tree easily. So I decide my pots based on what I can lift. And for me, a number 5 pot, which is slightly less than 5 gallons, is perfect. But I also do the maximum size now I do is a number 7, which is just below 7 gallons. And for me, that's perfect because I use a peat mix, which isn't too heavy. But if people are using soil in their pots, it's much heavier. You might only want to, do a smaller pot. So it's kind of what you can handle is, I guess, what I'm saying. But they will be bigger and more fruit for bigger pots.
That's helpful. And then another question about space was about planting a fig tree near the foundation of your house. Is there any concern with the fig tree roots interfering with the foundation, or should there be any root pruning be done? If you have any thoughts on that.
Can I answer that as an architect? First of all, you
Yeah.
never want to plant a tree next to your house. I mean, that's just common sense. I'm speaking as a woman who has a holly tree planted right up against her house, and it hasn't been a problem. But you want to try to eliminate that as an issue in the waterproofing on the exterior of the foundation of your house. So you want the center line of a tree to be at least 24 inches away from the house. You just don't want the roots to go that way. Now, I guess you could also root prune it along the house as it's growing to prevent the roots from growing in that direction.
I would say 2 feet away from the foundation is a really good recommendation because that's close enough to give you some heat from your foundation in your house, but 2 feet away is pretty good. I will say I have dug up and moved quite a few fig trees, and they're fairly easy to move because the roots aren't that strong, and there's no taproot like you find in an oak or a maple. So they're really a lot easier to move around, and the roots are kind of shallow and they're not that strong. They do get around and get in nooks and crannies, but they're not as tough as an oak or a maple, I've found.
Kermit, you talked a lot about getting a fig tree established. How long does that take in your experience before whether it's producing fruit or the watering needs are reduced? If you could answer that.
I'll mention the container first. It depends on the variety. Some figs will take 3 years to fruit or more, and some will only take one season. You'll get potentially fruit in the same season. So it depends on the variety, especially. And in a pot, I usually grow my figs around January, and then I up pot them to a 5 gallon in April. And then I would probably have fruit either around August or September, or the next year I'll have fruit in the next season around August. But usually it takes 1 to 2 years for the varieties I grow. Some have taken 3. It's pretty similar in the ground as well. But in the ground, I'll want to get it in the ground right after the frost. And I usually grow it in a pot first. You can go directly in the ground, but I usually grow in about a 5 gallon pot for a season, and then I'll put it in the ground. I find it gives it a better head start, especially if it's going to be cold, to have a more developed root structure before I put it in the ground. But if I put it in the ground 5 gallon in May, the next May, the following year, I would find that I wouldn't need to water it much. It'd be well established. The roots have been spreading and growing.
Another couple questions about pruning for height. So several folks were asking, is it okay to prune hard, like prune down from 20 feet to 5? Somebody else said they didn't prune and it's now too tall, they can't harvest. So is it okay to do a hard prune if you've sort of lost control of the tree?
Great question. I have seen people do hard prunes, and one of two things happens. It'll either grow brand new shoots from the base, and it won't grow any shoots from the stems that you pruned, or it'll start growing from the ones you pruned, like I showed in the pictures. So when you do a hard prune, it's hard to know which it'll happen. But either way, it's probably good for you because you're not going to kill the tree. It's really hard to kill a fig tree when it's that size. I think either way, you get the result you want. It would either grow scaffolds from what you pruned back heavily, or it would grow brand new shoots from the bottom and start anew.
Good. And then, Kermit, I think you just briefly answered this, but is it okay to transplant a fig, and any suggestions about how to do so well?
Everyone has their own method, I think, as a gardener to transplant, and probably whatever you're doing would be fine. But personally, what I do is I transplant a fig. I'll take some compost, and I'll dig a hole that's bigger than the pot of the plant I'm putting in. Then I'll put some compost, amend the soil, and mix it up. And I'll add some slow release fertilizer as well. I like to mound them up a little bit, a couple inches off the ground to create better drainage because I do have some problem with clay in my soils.
Is it too late in the season to do air layering now? Do you need to do that earlier in the summer?
It's probably too late right now to do it, but you could do it as an experiment. I really promote people to try new things all the time just to see what would happen. Be creative. That's one of the fun things about being a gardener and growing figs. In my experience, right now it'd be too late, but you might have a different experience if you try.
Okay. Some more questions about cultural conditions. So, specifically with respect to soil and in-ground planting, is it advisable to plant a tree in an area with soil and rocks so that the roots can wind around the rocks?
Yeah, I would give it a try. I've seen figs growing in rocky areas, and especially in the Middle East, I've seen that. So I'd give it a try. A lot of good thermal mass there too that could heat up in the winter.
And then with respect to light conditions, you mentioned that figs can grow in part shade and also full sun. Are there any specific varieties that you know that do well in that part shade condition?
From experience, I've seen Celeste seems to work pretty well because a lot of my neighbors have Celeste and they're partially shaded. I have Celeste partially shaded. It works well. I think Chicago Hardy could work well too.
My fig's a brown turkey and it ripens all over the tree, even though it's on the north side of the house and it's getting its light, east and west from the end of the site.
I think there's mostly several general questions about how to best overwinter in our Northern Virginia area, whether it's container or in ground, if you have any specific suggestions.
Most of my experience firsthand is with pots. You need to store them somewhere above freezing, a garage, or somewhere like a basement, cool basement. Um, the problem with storage in a warm area in the winter is it can grow if it's too warm. And if it grows in the dark or if it's not bright sunlight, you'll get a weak growth on your fig trees, which could get sunburned and damaged in the spring. So you have to be careful with that. My friends that have done in-ground protection in zone 6 have seen they need protection in cold winters. There's so many methods you can look on YouTube. There's ways to wrap them, to bury them slightly in mulch. And so there's a lot of methods to do that. I've never done a in-ground protection because I like to keep it simple. And at my test plot up at the garden, I actually see which ones are the most hardy and can withstand it. All right, harvesting. I'm going to turn this over to you, Beth.
Yeah, because I have a ginormous fig tree, and so my focus on figs is I have a huge harvest in the fall, and figs ripen best on the tree, and they will not ripen after you take them off the tree. And so you have to pick them when they're ripe and they need to be used immediately. Figs don't sweeten off the tree. And how long you're going to leave them on is very personal choice. Kermit likes his, I think, a little bit more ripe than I do, but you can tell these figs right here that they're ready to pick because they get the droop, the stems droop, and the skins begin to crack like this. That white sap that you will see when you harvest the figs is latex, and I know Kermit's had some very negative impact from that. So
Yeah, that picture there on the right is from our garden at Chinkapin, and that's a fig tree under the compost bin. And the owner of that plot would just walk by and would touch her skin. The next day, she would get these like blisters, and we finally figured out it was from the figs. So we helped her remove that fig tree so she wouldn't have it on her plot. So just something to watch out for.
these are some examples of figs that are ripened to different levels. And so you can see, obviously, these ones that are kind of dried up looking, that they have been left to hang as long as possible. Now, in order for that to happen, if I were to do this on my tree, the squirrels would eat them and they'd be gone. So Kermit does use bird screen to protect his figs so that he can let them ripen longer on the tree. But this is how they look beautiful. Look at the beautiful, rich color inside. And again, this is just some examples. Not all figs have to be dark colored to be ripe. There's a number of figs that don't achieve that dark color that you anticipate, but they're ripe and you can feel them when they're soft. They're getting ripe and they start to droop. In fact, I had somebody come to me at the plant clinic and say, my neighbor has a fig tree, it's hanging over my garden, and the figs are green, but I think they're ripe. What should I do? And I said, well, pick them. They're probably ripe. And if they're hanging over your garden, obviously they're for you to have. But you can see right here, and this is a green fig that is totally ripe. You can see the cracking of the skin. That's an indication. The skins are very fragile, and once they begin to crack like that, it's almost difficult to harvest them because the skin is so fragile, they'll start to rupture as you take them off the plant. And so, really transporting them becomes a huge issue. It's kind of like if you've ever harvested raspberries, it's the same kind of problem. You can't let them touch each other. If you clump them together, they will almost immediately start to mold and you'll have a lot of waste. And the skins are very, very fragile and prone to splitting and cracking. One of the ideal ways to transport them is in an egg carton, but honestly, you need a lot of egg cartons. So I have a large tree, and when the figs start coming, my immediate concern is what to do with them, how to harvest them quickly, and how to deal with them quickly, and prepare them and save as much of the fruit as possible. I kind of think of my fig tree, it's like having a big, hairy dog. It's very delightful, and people like it, and everybody wants it, and everybody wants to pet it and everything. But it's also a big, messy, smelly problem that I have to deal with once a year. But I'm very fond of it. They have a very short shelf life. You can keep them in the refrigerator for maybe a week. Freezing is by far the best way I have found to preserve the figs because they're indeterminate. So some days I will have 2 pounds of figs, and some days I'll have 4 figs. And that's just it. You have to be ready for it. And you can't say, oh, I'm going to fix figs for a meal this weekend because I might not have enough figs. So I'm going to have to find other ways to preserve them. So freezing is good. Also this year, I finally got a dehydrator, and I've been working to dehydrate the figs to prevent spoilage because I'm hopeful that this winter I'll be able to use them in a lot more recipes and cakes and pies and things that work well with dried figs. Most of my figs I freeze, and I freeze them in bags, and I open the bag up and put a few more in, and it maintains the color and works well with the kind of harvest that I have. And also, frozen figs work in any kind of recipe for any kind of jam or anything that would use cooked figs. And they don't lose their flavor with freezing. I just saw that in the chat box. Also dried figs. So here's my dehydrator. I'm dehydrating figs. So I've tried to dehydrate figs in the past. I've used my oven, used my air fryer, and the thing was always that you don't want to dehydrate them so that they're like fig chips. You want them to still have the texture, to still be somewhat soft. It's very hard to find that place where they don't spoil, where they're dry but they don't spoil. And the dehydrator recommends keeping them in glass jars and then removing the lids on the glass jars and monitoring their moisture in that way so that there's no moisture building up in the jars. And that has been really, really successful. So we're going to talk a little bit about eating and enjoying figs because I'm pretty sure that most people who are interested in having a fig tree are interested in eating and enjoying the figs that they're going to get. This is me and Kermit. In Kermit's garden, see, he's offering me a fig that he's just harvested. And you can see on the left-hand slide that he puts these little bags over his figs that protect them from the birds and squirrels. While there are a variety of fig flavors in the figs you might grow, in general, their flavors are very neutral. They're like a pear. They're not a strong flavor, but they have the kind of flavor that can either go sweet or savory, depending on what you pair them with. And there are a lot of things that they pair with naturally. So cheeses, goat cheese, herb cheese, any kind of sharp cheese. My husband really liked the jam on brie. Also, lemon juice or balsamic vinegar makes a huge difference in the taste of the fig jam. Honey, it's a natural with honey, and prosciutto or bacon, and then several herbs as well. So these are ideas of sweet and savory flavors you might want to pair your figs with. So this is what my figs look like when they've been harvested. So you can use them fresh. You can use them in salads. They're great paired with peaches or beets, and you can add them in a salad with cheese and then leafy greens. Or you can eat them in yogurt or cereal or anywhere where you would use fresh fruit. They're really, really versatile that way. I really had to go beyond that because I have so many figs and I'm always, always, always looking for new ways to use them. And I've discovered if you like smoothies, they make an excellent smoothie. They're absolutely ideal for that with bananas, yogurt, honey, milk. The great thing about figs, they are full of potassium, calcium, magnesium, and fiber. They're very high fiber. So if you want to add fiber to your life and have a lovely fresh fruit taste, figs are the answer. I do currently make two different kinds of fig jam. This is where I started when I started getting tremendous number of figs. I started making fig jam and started trying to find people to give it away to. So what I would call a traditional sweet jam is a fig I make with lemon and thyme. It's very good on toast. And you can see there's a picture of the figs. Those are frozen figs that are in that pan being started for jam. But my favorite fig jam is a balsamic fig jam with thyme. It's sweet and savory. It's very versatile. Pairs well with cheese. Delicious as spread on toast or crackers. And in addition, a friend of mine who does Middle Eastern cooking says she always adds it when she makes soups and stews. And you can use it as a glaze for roasted chicken. I think you could use that other fig jam, the sweet one, as a glaze for roasted chicken as well. So this is the way we commonly serve this jam in our house. We get a round of brie and we put the fig jam on top of it. And you can serve that with any kind of cracker or anything. And I will say, for the sake of my friends who are gluten intolerant, that you can works well with rice crackers and different kinds of corn crackers, not based on wheat. Or if you are vegetarian or want to use more vegetables and fruit, you can serve this on apple slices. It's very good. So I don't know if you remember this, the sort of thing your mom used to make in the 80s for Bridge Club. Take a small brie, put the jam on the top, use center it on crescent rolls. You bring them up to the center, make, a little knot on the top, bake it in the oven for 20 minutes, cut it into wedges and serve it with crackers. This was so good that I made it to take photographs of it. My husband took the rest of it and ate it. So highly recommended by my husband. And this is called Figs in a Blanket, which honestly does exactly look like pigs in a blanket. In this, you use fresh figs, but I'm also sure it would work well with dried figs if you wanted to be able to use it all winter. But you cook it in honey and vinegar with red pepper paste. Now, this is very savory. And take half of a fig, stuff cheese in it, and wrap it in a flaky pastry or the crescent rolls. You bake them for 20 to 25 minutes, serve them warm or cool. So I served this recently at a party and I was taste testing it among my friends. And the advice I got from the guys was that it would be better if it had bacon or prosciutto in it. So maybe I will add that to it next time I make this recipe. These are served hot. You could serve them cold too. I gave a bunch cold to my neighbors since I had a batch of them. I had a bunch left over and they enjoyed them.
Beth, let me ask you some questions that came up in the chat. One is, what is the whitish part on the outside of a ripe fig? Or maybe it's just when you have the cut fig. That's what they meant.
Well, it's kind of like the skin. It isn't like the part where the seeds, it's just different from where the seeds are. It doesn't taste any different. It all tastes the same.
And then another question was, do you wash your figs after you pick them before you
I
cook
do.
or eat them?
I rinse them off. Now to be fair, that's mostly just to get off dirt that's in the atmosphere. I don't use any kind of pesticides in my garden, so there are no chemicals on them.
Someone was curious about whether or not you know what the variety is of the fig that's in the small space garden.
Well, that's interesting because I went over there and they said to me, it's a brown turkey. And I swear I wouldn't have known this at all if I didn't know Kermit, who looked at my fig, which I thought was a Chicago Hardy, and he said, this is not a Chicago Hardy. Now, it was labeled Chicago Hardy when I bought it. So what did I know? The leaves are different. So they thought their fig was a brown turkey. And I said, oh no, I think it's a Chicago Hardy. And since then, for instance, I was at the garden center a couple weeks ago and they happened to park right next to the figs. And I went through and I was looking at the different figs and the different fig leaves. So the brown turkey has a leaf that's like a flat hand, with like thick fingers, whereas the Chicago Hardy has got deep indents between the leaves. So I guess it isn't all that obvious, and you might in some cases need the fruit to finally identify it. We might have to do a whole separate class on fig tree identification.
And one clarification from Robbie, the whitish that they were talking about was on the skin, and they were wondering if it could potentially
Oh,
be mold
the
or.
whitish stuff on the skin is the latex, which is a chemical that is in the fruit. In fact, you will get it on your hands. When I get it, when I pick them too, it oozes a little bit. So if you think you have any kind of allergy to latex at all, you better use gloves when you're around the tree.
Robbie has one more question. How do you get it off? Can you wash it off, or how else can you deal with that?
Oh, you can wash it off.
Latex.
If I were allergic to it, I'd find another hobby. I mean, really, I know. I mean, I really am really allergic to poison ivy, and if I'm anywhere near it, I get it, and I don't want that to happen. So,
There were some questions about pests. Most people have some issues with squirrels and rabbits.
wasn't
I'm just curious if you have any suggestions of how to protect your figs or if there's nothing to be done with that problem.
well, squirrels and rabbits, squirrels and birds. Squirrels and birds. Somehow the catbirds this year have discovered my figs and they're over there all the time. Okay, I have a very large tree, and so what I always say is that there's plenty for me and plenty for the birds and squirrels. And they do really take the ones that are more at the top. But I also can't let them get as ripe as probably I might ideally like, because if they start to get overripe, the squirrels will take them. I will tell you there's one other really wonderful thing that I've had happen in relation to my fig tree, and that is, I don't know if anybody knows what bald-faced hornets are like, but they are a large black hornet, and apparently they are actually related more to a bee than a hornet. And they're very large. And like I'm talking about 3 inches wide, and when they're flying, they make this buzzing sound. So I was over in my garden and they were just over there buzzing, and I thought, what is going on? And I was kind of, somewhat afraid of large hornets. And I realized that a lot of my figs had ripened and I had a lot of flies. And the hornets were taking the flies right out of the air. And it turns out these hornets are predatory and they eat flies. And I'm like, they paid no attention to me at all. They were busy eating flies. So it was quite a dramatic scene. I wish I'd gotten pictures of it.
The
All right.
demonstration of the ecosystem.
Speaking of having some pork with your figs, this is one other choices you can do. Bake them in the oven. Same thing. Cheese, prosciutto, figs, delicious. So we're down to figgy pudding, which is renowned in Christmas carols. Genuine figgy pudding is a steamed pudding. It's British, and it's made with dried figs and raisins. In fact, it is like a fruit cake. So I think you could certainly make any kind of fruit cake and make primary ingredient figs. There's so many more things that I didn't even mention here. There's fig cakes, fig tarts, fig cookies. You can make fig Newtons. There are fig drinks, beautiful fig sangria. Use your imagination. It is extraordinary. Someone's saying simple syrup. And when you talking about figs and recipes, you get a lot of choices. So fig syrup is made out of fig leaves. And I understand that it smells and tastes like coconuts. And I have a wonderful recipe someone just gave me for another fig jam, which uses and cognac. So I'm going to try that soon.
Thank you all for joining us today, and especially to Beth and Kermit. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation on figs. And I hope you all have a great weekend.